Want to welcome all of you in the room. Also have a whole ton of people on Zoom for this one, so audience. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to thank the First National Bank for sponsoring this program. We really appreciate that. And I also want to thank the Belfast Library, as always, for hosting our meetings. It's great. Our speaker today, who is behind me on Zoom, is Douglas Tallamy. He's an entomologist, and I would call him an ecologist extraordinaire, fantastic ecologist from University of Delaware. Doug is also a prolific writer of books on interactions between insects and plant community diversity. And I admire anyone that has the energy to write a book, because I certainly have never wanted to do that. His talk today is on Nature's Best Hope, which is also the title of one of his most popular books, which was on the New York Times bestsellers list. So just a couple of items of order. Please, those of you on Zoom, do not use the chat unless you have a problem that you can't see what's being shown or something like that. If there's some sort of operational problem. We have too many people on Zoom for conversations to be going on in the chat and popping up and down all through the presentation. So at the end, we will call on, if we have time for questions, we'll call on people who raise their hands using the raise hand function down at the bottom of the screen. And I hope we'll have time for some Q&A, both out of the room and on the Zoom during the presentation. That's all I have to say. So Doug, take it away.
All right, thank you. We've got a screen share here. Can everybody see that? Yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Susan. Pleasure to be here. I want to talk to you about what my idea of nature's best hope is, and I'll give you a spoiler. You are nature's best hope. So today's talk is really about why I think you are nature's best hope. But before we talk about why I think you're nature's best hope, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. E.O. Wilson, of course, was a professor at Harvard for many decades. He died the day after Christmas 2 years ago, and it was a terrible loss to the world of conservation. One of the things that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on Earth. He loved biodiversity, and he wanted to save it, not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a wonderful idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside and all the things that are endangered will be fine. It'll be a wonderful world. The problem is half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And we've got 8 billion people in the other half, along with all of our roadways and airports and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So people are wondering, how can we actually do this? That's basically what I want to talk about today. I do think we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation to do it. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened in the East Coast in 2019. We had a very large oak mast. Members of the Red Oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. When it finally plopped down, that's a dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. It takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa, and then surprisingly stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the very next year? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if it came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn, their old home is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move, time to grab the larvae, grab the eggs. The entire colony moves into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, fly up to a mile from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the soil, the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. Well, for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And the oak trees depend on that dispersal. The specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over 1/3 of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. You won't have Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could go on and on and on talking about nature's specialized relationships. The point I want to make this afternoon, though, is that these relationships, nature itself, are now on the ropes. And they're on the ropes primarily because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the lower 48 states as they were. There's only about 5% left anywhere close to its original pristine ecological condition. And most of those areas are mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. And you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we need them to sustain, because it is nature that keeps us alive on planet Earth. So you might wonder why we've done this. I wonder why we've done this, and I don't know, but I suspect that we thought our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. And of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's 1/3 of our North American bird population already gone. Now the UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. And they actually said that 2 years ago. So now it's the next 18 years. Makes a nice headline, but this is not an option, folks. We depend on these species. These are the species that keep us alive on the planet. So we have to make sure that does not happen. If I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and thus upon all of our houses, but that is not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if planet Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news, though, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide us. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do that we depend on every day, like production of oxygen, pretty important. Clean water. Plants are cleaning water and then slowing its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root systems. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have put there over the eons. And once it's in the soil, it's extremely stable, can stay there for thousands of years. Plants build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. If we were to lose our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that will be hard. What do animals do for plants? Lots of things, but here are some important ones. Pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves, they're doing the best they can, but it's obviously not good enough because we are now in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced, which means we're going to have to up our conservation game. We're going to have to start to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups that have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in his most famous book, The Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion is so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, this afternoon, I want to argue that not only is living with nature an option, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head, and we need to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. Most of the land is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85%, 8.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. Over 90% of Maine is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it correctly. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. That has been our conservation model for the last century. But we need to go beyond that now. We need to restore nature in so many of the places where we've destroyed it. In other words, we're talking about restoration, putting it back together again. But before you tell me you're never going to put it back together again exactly the way it was, I know that. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions so that we have functioning ecosystems again, even if it's not exactly what was on that space at some point in the past. In order to do that, though, we need to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most important groups, and there's two groups we cannot do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course, the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are making all the food that supports just about all the animals through photosynthesis, turning that sunlight into food. Then they store it in their plant parts. So now we have the food that drives life on planet Earth in plant leaves. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants, invertebrates like insects, and not just any insect. It turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee at my house in Southeast Pennsylvania. You have the black-capped chickadee, practically the same bird doing the same thing. They are one of the birds that are feeders all winter long, eating seeds, and we tend to think that's all chickadees need. Well, even in the wintertime, chickadees only get 50% of their diet from seeds. The other 50% is from insects and spiders, even in the winter. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they give up on seeds and they switch to invertebrates, mostly insects. And if they are in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students, Ashley Kennedy, did a few years ago. She put out a call to bird photographers to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they're carrying food to the nest. Send those pictures to Ashley. She will identify the prey items that are in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as she could. And it was very successful. She got thousands of pictures. So you're looking at a summary of her results for the 20 most common bird families in North America. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen if we design landscapes that don't have enough caterpillars in them? Most of our birds wouldn't be able to successfully reproduce. Something special about caterpillars, what is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff caterpillars down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. If you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beak's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. Then finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From what they eat, of course. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? 1 or 2 a day enough? Well, that's a good question. So let's go back to chickadees. There's a lot of data on chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? 1 or 2 is not enough. 1 or 2 a day is not enough. It takes thousands. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get 1 clutch of Carolina chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And that depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make 1 nest of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places, that's all we have is our yards, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. And that's true for most birds. They're foraging very close to their nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodline. And if we landscape in a way that does not create all of those insects, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major reasons that birds are declining. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's a Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, and divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups: the species that require insects, typically when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like finches and doves can actually make a little milk out of seeds, and that's what they rear their young on. And look, the birds that don't require insects did not decline at all in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects declined on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, and that's be pretty. So now we're going to ask them to do 2 things: be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. And you're not going to be ecologically functional unless the landscape has a lot of caterpillars. So how do we add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you do that by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. And it seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we use, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the crepe myrtle and all the burning bush and all the barberry and all the ginkgos and all the hostas, all the plants we typically landscape with from Asia in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to create a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweed species. That's called host plant specialization. And most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. Plants want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded the leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat the plants for which they have very specialized adaptations, specialized enzymes that allow them to store and excrete and detoxify the compounds in those leaves, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of interaction with those plants for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect's locked into eating that particular plant lineage. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch's not going to start to eat the hostas. It can't. It's locked into eating milkweeds, which means it has two choices in that case. It either flies away and finds milkweeds someplace else, if they are someplace else, or starves to death. Turns out there are 3 kinds of plants out there: plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively detract energy from local food webs. Best example of a contributor through most of the country is one of our oaks. They're contributing more energy to local food webs than any other type of plant. Good example of a non-contributor would be ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a pretty tree, but nothing eats it, so it's not contributing any energy to our local food webs. And a real good example over much of the country is of a detractor would be calorie pear or any of our invasive ornamentals, burning bush, buckthorn, all of those guys. Not only are they not producing, they're not putting energy into local food webs, they're detracting it by escaping and becoming serious invasive species, pushing out the native plants that do contribute energy to those food webs. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to restore ecosystems, we have to restore the food webs within those ecosystems. And the only way to do that is to choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when we do choose the right plants, starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000 into a farm that had been broken up into 10-acre lots. Last thing they did was a farm for a very long time, about 300 years. Last thing they did was mow it for hay. So we wanted to restore the farm, and I knew I had to put caterpillars back to do that, but I'd never done that before. So one of the first things I tried was the Canadian owlet. I wanted to see if I could get this beautiful caterpillar to make a living at our house. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, the only thing Canadian owlets eat is meadow rue, and we didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure it was there hundreds of years ago, but long gone with all the agriculture. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and planted them, and they grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my meadow rue. So I didn't go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. And then one day I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over, it was covered with Canadian owlets. I'm still impressed with that. They had found it right away. So now I've got a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's actually a misnomer for this beautiful moth. It has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know where there were some about 14 miles away and a paraline cut. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, they took over my front yard this year. That's okay. I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Biden's, but they did. And now we have a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the restoration. Same story with the hackberry emperor. Wanted the hackberry emperor at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that should be interacting on our property. But like its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry, so I planted a couple of hackberry trees. Had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they finally did, and I've got a good population of them as well. So now I've added 6 species to the property, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. Along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now, this is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't come. This is what a caterpillar looks like, pretty little thing. It's still part of the fun, though. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and check for these caterpillars. One of these years I'm going to find them, and that'll be a great year. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear people don't like Virginia creeper. I just don't know why they don't like it. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color, makes a good ground cover. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down, makes valuable, nutritious berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they're high in fat. Our migrating birds need high fat berries, and our overwintering birds need high fat berries. And it's a great pollinator plant. Those berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know it's in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around that plant. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are primary food diet for cardinals. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-tooth prominent at our house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. Even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. It's a specialist on elm. And of course, we didn't have particularly American elm. We didn't have any American elm. We lost that decades ago to the Dutch elm disease. But there are two big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. And every year they drop a lot of seeds. So shortly after we moved in, I gathered up some of those seeds from the curb, planted them at home. They germinate in 6 days. Those trees grow very fast. Today, those trees are 80 feet tall, and they did attract the double-toothed prominent American elm. Wanted to see if I get the evening primrose moth at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we didn't have any evening primrose, Enothera, so I planted that. The moth came, spends a day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plants that we put back on our property. I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I don't want to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is doing on your property, what it's contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it immediately. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to attract the moths that lay the caterpillars that run the food web at our house, like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars have come to the oaks on my property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that's just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. You do not have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to contribute to the local ecosystem. They do it immediately. This is what our yard looks like today. Actually, this is where the Bidens colonized, but it's just to show you, we put a lot of plants back on the property. Not all of them, I'm still working on that. But over the years, my research has shown that the number of moth species in your local food web is a good index of how stable and productive that food web is. So 5 years ago, I made it a goal to try to take a picture of every species of moth that is making a living at my house. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,199 species of moths so far. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these species are types of bird food, we've recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? This is another headline we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I am convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We could turn a lot of these terrible statistics around. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres. A lot of people have less land than that. Will it work on smaller plots, let's say in suburbia? Well, that's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they're in the middle of a development. All their neighbors had the big lawns. When they moved into their property, it was choked with bush honeysuckle, armor honeysuckle, another major invasive species from Asia. So they got rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they are up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. That's an incredible number. Just to compare that to what we've seen at our house, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards, though? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. Right over here is O'Hare Airport. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She is not connected to any natural area at all. So she's a tiny little island in Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper, but she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature, and then she sat back and counted the birds that are using her yard. She's up to 124 bird species, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcocks. If you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we do want to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we've got to reduce the area we have in lawn. We have now it's about 44 million acres of lawn dedicated to an ecological deadscape. That's bigger than the area of all of New England. And why do we do that? Well, lawn is a status symbol, and we need to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we were to cut the area of lawn in half? Not get rid of it, just reduce the area, cut it in half. What if we took places like this and turned them into this? I got this picture from Dan Getman in Missouri, who had this big lawn, and he said, I'm doing it. I'm putting all these plants back. And he sent me the picture. Well, let's say we've got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to make the math simple, cut it in half. That would give us 20 million acres that we could put towards conservation right at home. That's so much land. We could create a new national park. If we do it at home, I'm going to call it Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put a park at home? What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to develop a relationship with that part of Mother Nature at your own time, your own pace. All you have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out your window. You can avoid crowds. If you go to a real national park, 375 million people who were there last year, they'll be there with you. It's free. There's no admission fee. There are no travel hassles. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. You get to experience the natural world alone. Build some kind of connection with the natural world, because if you don't have that connection, you're not going to care about it. This is particularly important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus, and they drive for an hour with a teacher, go to a natural area, then they walk around for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside alone and get to know it. Develop a relationship with it. I'm stressing alone. If we hover over them as parents, we're sending the message that this is dangerous, that this is something you should fear. We don't want to send that message. Our kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they're afraid to steward it, if they don't love stewarding it, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we cannot afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives on a very modest patch of nature in Hawaii. It's a piece of lawn and a hedge. But there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so you don't see those lizards, or the lizard can't see you coming. Then you crawl slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of the lizard. You learn how to become a good steward of that part of the natural world. As a matter of fact, you fall in love with that part of the natural world. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. Got this picture not long ago, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii, and I guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, please do. It's free. You go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and put in where you live and the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to cut your area of lawn in half. You put that area down. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree or something else that's appropriate for where you live. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Whatever you do, it counts, and you record that area on the website, and then your little piece of your county will pop up. You get to see other people in your counties who are participating in Homegrown National Park. This is our effort to get the message that everybody, not just tree huggers, but everybody is an important component of the future of conservation. We want that message to go viral. We are asking people to reduce the area in lawn. Lawn's not ecologically doing anything for us. We're going to replace that lawn with some of those very powerful contributing natives, remove the invasives that are on our property. Most people do have invasive species on their property. They don't even know it. If everybody removed the invasives from their property, we'd be 85% done east of the Mississippi. If your property is protecting any natural areas, you want to continue to do that. There are real ecological products of Homegrown National Park, a significant increase in biodiversity, and that's certainly what we've seen at my house. Measurable reduction in those invasive species if everybody gets rid of them. And by the way, when you get rid of the invasive species, it reduces the seed rain down on our public properties and makes their control much more easily accomplished. We're going to turn lawn into things like this. It's going to create a significant drawdown in atmospheric CO2, so we're going to help climate change. We're going to start to transform areas outside of parks and preserves into viable habitat, and therefore create connectivity between those parks, which will help biodiversity a lot. There's also a sociological product, national awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are. We're trying to change the culture. I want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not just there for our entertainment. It's something that's essential, and everybody has responsibility to sustain it, for sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is great, but we need to take action now. And we also want to merge all of these successful conservation efforts that are out there. There's Sierra Club and Audubon and National Wildlife Federation and Wild Ones and lots of organizations all doing wonderful things. But because we're not charging, we're not pulling any membership away from those organizations. We just want them to record their conservation on private property on the map so we can see how well we're really doing. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the areas that are now in lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them should be keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. When you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, when you take keystone plants out of our local food webs, the food web collapses because those plants are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants, the keystone plants, are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that are holding that house up. They're essential. They're the support system. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. You're not through building your house when you got your keystone plants, but it's an essential first step. So the question is no longer simply, are native plants ecologically better than non-native plants? On average, they certainly are, but there's a lot of natives that aren't contributing all that much either. So the question really is, do we want to put the most powerful plants in there? The ones that are supporting the most bees, the most pollinators, and the most caterpillars? Or not? What is supporting the most caterpillars? It's one of our oak species, at least where oaks occur. Now, when you get into northern Maine, the oaks drop out, and then it's going to be your conifers. But through most of the country, oaks are supporting over 950 species of caterpillars. Where I live, 557 species of caterpillars. No other plant genus comes close to that. How do you find out what the best keystone plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the best woody plants and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. This is what lists look like, very similar to this over most of the country. Now, I stopped here because I ran out of room. The lists are much bigger than this. I want to focus on these guys, the herbaceous, top-ranked herbaceous plants. Goldenrod rods are always very high. Asters are very high. Perennial sunflowers very high wherever we go. Not only in terms of supporting caterpillars, but also in terms of supporting those specialist pollinators. When you're making a pollinator garden, you want to plant for the specialists because the generalists can use those plants as well. If you only plant for the generalists, you lose all those specialists. So if you have goldenrods, native asters, and sunflowers in your yard, there are at least 44 species of bees that could be in your yard that won't be if you don't have those plants. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yards, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research showing that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines. These are all the ways that lights are killing insects. It seems pretty grim, but actually it's good news to me, because we've got to turn around insect decline. We've already lost more than 45% of the insects on the planet. And they are the little things that run the world. So if we can turn that around by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There's a lot of switches to flick, but we're good switch flickers. But I know what you're going to say. Well, gee, I can't turn the light out over my barn or my garage or my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb, yellow LED, yellow incandescent. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our white or blue wavelengths. So if we were to switch out our white bulbs with yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars as well. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite one of the mosquito foggers to come control all of our insects, kill all of our insects. This is the booming business around the country. But they say it's okay because they're fogging a natural product. And it's true. It's pyrethroids from chrysanthemums. It's a natural product. It's industrial strength pyrethroids, but it is naturally created. I don't like that argument because cyanide is a natural product too. Ricin is a natural product. There's a number of very deadly compounds that are natural products. So being natural doesn't mean it's safe. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. And I wish they were right about that, but they're not even close to right. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with. And look, it comes in contact with everything. All those pollinators we're trying to save, the monarch butterfly. 2 years ago, there was a big monarch kill, hundreds of dead monarchs when they flew through Mosquito Joe. The interesting thing is it doesn't control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. It's too hard. You have to control 90% of the adults to be successful. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%. So he's not even close to actually being functional. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay or maybe dead grass, let it ferment for a couple of days. You're going to build up the population of diatoms and algae in your bucket. And that becomes an irresistible brew to the local mosquitoes who want to lay their eggs. And they'll lay their eggs right in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks, $9, $12. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquito larvae. So you put that in your bucket, the mosquito larvae chew on it, and they die. It's very targeted. If you have a dragonfly larva in here, it's not going to hurt it at all. If your dog drinks it, it's not going to hurt it at all. You might put a coarse screen over your bucket so your local chipmunk doesn't commit suicide. But it's targeted, it's cheap, it's effective, particularly if everybody does it. But if you're going to use your yard only a couple times during the summer, have a party, get a fan. Turn it on. It creates a directed flow. The mosquitoes can't fly into it. So you can enjoy your yard without killing anything. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows those caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. This is just an example. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillars eat the leaves, they spin a cocoon, hang from the tree, emerge as an adult, then they do it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil surface and pupate underground. Or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. Too messy. And we mow and compact the soils under those trees so that they're rock hard. The caterpillars can't get underground, and this becomes an ecological trap. The moths lay their eggs here, the caterpillars grow and drop down and die. And the next generation smaller till finally they disappear. I'm convinced that this is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You've got a tree in a yard, and I've got a new grad student this year who's starting to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, a layered landscape. Maybe have a dogwood here, a native azalea, ferns, ground covers. It's soft landing. The caterpillar drops down. The ground is not compacted. They can easily get underground to pupate. Plenty of leaf litter under here. They can spin their cocoon. Nobody's going to mow them. Nobody's going to step on them. Much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. Put big beds around your trees. The bigger, the better. That's how you shrink the lawn. All safe sites. The tree will love it, by the way. Use your native ground covers liberally, like wild ginger, native pachysandra. This is the Virginia creeper I mentioned earlier. Golden seal, mayapple, foam flower, ferns. There's lots of examples of ground covers that are ideal for creating safe sites for those caterpillars. Not only will the tree love it, but when you can see the ground, you don't have enough plants there. Green mulch is the way to go. How do you start creating a bed from lawn? Just start with those leaves in the fall. Pile them up thickly. It'll smother the grass. Then you can plant right through that in the spring. Instant flower bed. Another former grad student, Desiree Narango's done some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And some of the results of her study suggest there is room for compromise in our plant choices. And I think that's good news. What she did was ask one simple question. Are landscapes that are dominated by native plants, how well do they support chickadees compared to landscapes dominated by introduced ornamental plants? And when they're dominated by introduced ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. Those landscapes are 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. All the yards had nest boxes up in them, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. And if you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, down here where you have very few non-native plants, then you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies than adults die, anything over here where you got a lot of non-native plants, that is an unsustainable shrinking population. So right here is where those lines intercept, liberally speaking, which suggests this is the area of compromise. You can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass. And we looked at woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. Up to 30% without destroying the local food web. So we can't tolerate any invasives. No barberry, no burning bush, no buckthorn. Those are ecological tumors that escape and then castrate the local ecosystem. But there are a lot of ornamental plants, non-native ornamental plants that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? This is a ginkgo from Asia. Why does he have a ginkgo from Asia in his native planting? Well, Dan's wife likes ginkgos, and she asked him to put one in. So he did. Is this plant destroying the functionality of this landscape? No. Is it going to escape and wreck the woodlot? No. It's just there. So I like to think of plants like that as if they're statues. So there you go. There's Dan's statue. If everything was a statue, it would be a non-functional landscape, but it's not. It's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those contributors, those powerful native plants that are contributing the most energy to local food webs. If we increase those, we can tolerate many of these. Can we use native plants in formal designs? course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken by a drone 400 feet up. You don't get more formal than that. And every single plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor this isn't just a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. Not very big, could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help our pollinators. Why do we need to help pollinators? Well, you hear all the time that's because they pollinate a third of our crops. That's not true. They pollinate about a 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the agriculture argument. We need pollinators and we need them everywhere because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. Losing our pollinators means we're losing 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. It has nothing to do with agriculture. How about this? Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has been doing it for a while. They've got a cost-sharing program that pays homeowners to reduce or replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program now. There's an island off of Florida that is paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on invasive ornamentals like calorie pear. That's what Fayetteville, Arkansas did, St. Louis, Missouri. South Carolina has banned them altogether. North Carolina's got a bounty on him. Take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Water utilities, giving people $100 coupons to put in water efficient native plants. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in the far West, particularly California. This has gone up now. You get $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn you replace with a xeric planting. California does not have one drop of rain to waste on lawn. And if you want more information on all those programs, memorize that. All right, I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's serious. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like nature. We like to visit it, like to hike in it, but it's not essential. And that means when resources are in short supply, when push comes to shove, and that's always, nature will take a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. Want to save these wonderful places so that future generations can ignore it. And I get that. Nature's enormously entertaining, but it's much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about that, but if we restrict conservation just the areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small, too few, and too isolated. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biospheres as reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests that there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. There's certainly places on planet Earth where we've destroyed the ecological significance, but every square inch has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we have to glue our rug back together again, folks. We've got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that connect viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats where we've destroyed them. This is starting to happen. It is starting to happen. And when it does happen, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with the natural world. And that will be a wonderful day. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet, but I don't know why, because every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset is, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people are recognizing the planet's in trouble these days, and they want to help, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can put in keystone plants. One person can add a pollinator garden. One person can modify their light system. One person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person can get rid of their invasive plants. One person can do a lot to improve the ecological integrity of their little piece of the earth. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You will get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. So I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we have time for a few questions. Maybe a couple from the room, and if you're on Zoom, please go down to the bottom to the reactions thing and put the hand up thing so that we can see you. You'll come to the top of the list. Question from the room. Yeah.
So, Doug, what's your recommendation while we're saving all the caterpillars to deal with the defoliators like the gypsy moth, or our favorite here in mid-coast Maine, the brown tab?
Yeah, well, good point. When I talk about saving caterpillars, I'm talking about saving native caterpillars. When we introduce species from other countries, whether it's plants or insects, they cause tremendous amounts of problems because they're here without their natural enemies. So no, we don't want to save the brown-tailed moth. We don't want to save the winter moth. We don't want to save the gypsy moth, which, by the way, is now the spongy moth. So yeah, and first of all, the birds don't even like them. They're hairy. They don't like hairy caterpillars. So yes, feel free to do whatever you can to get rid of them.
Except cut down oaks.
Yeah, no, that's not the solution.
BT works.
Oh, I mean, really, I know a lot of
BT
people are
works,
cutting
yeah.
down the oaks in their yard.
Another, yes, back there, please.
Hi, I'm involved with a small landscape company, and all of our customers always want mulch. And I know you said green mulch, especially when everything's filled in, which is great, but what about in the beginning when you planted plants that will stretch out, and there is a lot of open space, and it's windy, so you don't want to just put leaves, and you don't want the compost mulch to run away in the rain. What do you suggest?
Yeah, well, this is a judgment call. Bare soil is the worst. You don't want bare soil. The best mulch really is leaves, but it's got to be able to stay there. So you're right. If it's dry and it's blowing away, that could be a time where you actually mulch those leaves, grind them up, and then put them there. They're much more stable that way. But that also grinds up everything that's in those leaves. But the object of using leaves is that it returns the nutrients those trees use that year to the soil so they can use it again in the future. Bark mulch is better than bare ground, but it actually draws nitrogen out of the soil in order to break it down, and it can get pretty impenetrable. Actually, sometimes you feel under bark mulch, and it's actually quite dry. So it's my least favorite, but again, it's better than bare soil.
So we have two questions I see in the chat there. Can you see them, Doug? Is
Let's
there a
see.
list someplace of the most powerful plants to put in our yards?
Yes, there is. That's what that native plant finder is. So you put in your zip code. That's native plant finder in the National Wildlife Federation website. Put in your zip code, and those powerful plants will pop up for your county. And we have it for every county in the country. What time of year is the best time to look for caterpillars? The best time of year to look for caterpillars is late July, early August. If you look in the spring, you'll find one or two here and there, but the birds are going to find them first. They are really good at finding those caterpillars, and that's when they're rearing their young. So they're going to do better than you. The caterpillars are hiding from you all day long because they don't want to get eaten by the birds. So a good time to look for them is at night when they come out and they're out on the leaves. So go out with your flashlight at night and shine them up in the trees, and you'll be much more successful.
So Diantha, could you unmute and ask your question, please? You have to unmute yourself.
I have a lot of red oaks. I have mulch rings of leaves around some of them, doing what we can. The one thing, and I'm not that much lawn, but the one thing about lawn is it's less likely to harbor deer ticks, which are a real plague right now, and a health threat. And the more I think about planting more and more planted beds, the more I think about how much more tick habitat I'm creating. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
I do. Plants don't create ticks. It's deer that create ticks and white-footed mice. That's the life cycle. Now, yeah, plants they don't like dry places. So you need areas of high humidity. But a lot of people think if you plant native plants, you're going to have a lot of ticks. We have too many ticks because we've got too many deer. When we were growing up, we didn't have Lyme disease, we didn't have deer ticks, and we didn't have too many deer. So getting the deer back under the carrying capacity is the real solution to that. I've had Lyme disease 5 times, so I get it. I understand, but paving over the world so that we don't get Lyme disease is putting a Band-Aid on the wrong end. We've got to look at the actual ecological cause of these tick explosions and address it there. Getting rid of the rodents is a bad idea too. They're a vital component of the food web. So it's the fact that we've gotten rid of all the deer predators, given them perfect habitat, and allowed them to explode that is causing the problem. And that becomes a sociological issue. We know how to control deer, but it's people who say don't do it. So,
is there another question from the room? We can only take a couple more questions. No? Good. Okay. Then I can answer one question, the question of how to share this with family and friends. It will be posted on the library YouTube site whenever I get around to sending it to Brenda so it can be posted because it was recorded. And the other question was, so many people inject trees with neonicotinoids, I can never pronounce that, to get rid of brown-tailed moth and woolly adelgid. Any comments?
yeah, it's certainly not necessary to get rid of brown-tailed moths. You already mentioned it. A single spraying of BT will do that, and it's not a systemic. Neonicotinoids are systemics they'll last years. They are 7,000 times more toxic than DDT was to insects. We're overusing them terribly. So be cautious. When the guy who suggests you use neonics is the guy who's going to make money when you do use them, think about it. Hemlock woolly adelgid, terrible problem. And that can be the only way to save your hemlock, at least temporarily. But it is a temporary solution. We keep trying to get some biocontrol effort that'll work. Hasn't succeeded so far. So I would say use them as cautiously as possible. They're already banned in Europe for good reasons. So we don't want to overuse them. And right now we are terribly overusing them.
So there's one other question up there, which is very general. What's the best way to get rid of invasive plants? And I can have some comments on this afterwards, but
Okay. Well, there's a number of ways to do it. You have to kill the root system or they come back. So you can whack them out. That works. You can smother them. That can work depending on what it is. The easiest thing is some type of insecticide. I mean herbicide. I don't like to spray because you're always hitting on targets. But if it's a woody invasive, you cut it off at the stem and paint it. So it's using very little material. That works well. But simply snipping it and walking away, it slows them down, but they will come back and you'll do that the rest of your life. I've already tried that.
have we?
And I'm getting old, so.
Thank you very much. This was a great presentation. We appreciate you taking.
Very
the time.
welcome.
And
All right, carry on, everybody.
Buying your books.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. So I do want to make an announcement about our next program, which is next week, an evening program. Am I quiet now? On community composting. And there are little brochures on it in the back, so you can check that out. Do I need to say anything else? I think, no, we're done. And we're going to take a little break, and then our regular membership meeting is at 1:30.